Welcome to Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, looking at our actual literary skill that we're moving on. Once again, we are continuing with our module standards. We're looking at reading informational text because we know that the history and the social context drives the literature, and at this time period, historically, we just don't have time for writings that aren't serving our primary purpose. Hopefully by now you know what the primary purpose of the Puritans was. We've already reviewed your overall objectives, so they are in here for you to look at, but I want to focus a little bit more on your chunk objectives. In your task analysis, where we are right now, we are looking at our text-dependent questions, and we're focusing specifically on the imagery, focusing on figurative language, and on rhetorical appeal. And so I wanted to go a little more in depth with the rhetorical appeal. Whether you aced the skills test to begin with, or you needed those lessons and you're still a little bit fuzzy on it, I still wanted to look at it in practice and replicate for you what is expected of you in this task. If you will, please take a moment to go ahead and get out your text-dependent questions, rhetorical appeals, and figurative language analysis. Your chunk objective is that through the study of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, you're going to be able to identify the imagery, to explain its role in rhetoric, to recognize figurative language and explain the impact on the text, to recognize rhetorical appeal and explain the function, and then to evaluate the purpose of the sermon genre. You already know what the purpose of a sermon is. We've spoken of what the purpose of Puritan writing was already, but we want to be more specific as we move forward. As we move into the model, I want to kind of help you look at the steps that we're going to be following here so that you'll know exactly what's going on. I'm not sure why, but my numbers didn't really show up, so I'll just add them in. So the first step is going to be to paraphrase. That is what we mastered with Plymouth Plantation. We looked at the who and the what and the action and came up with a paraphrase and just looked at what's he saying. Number 2, I want you to think through each of the 3 appeals. What does the text seem to do? How does it seem like it's trying to make me think something? That'll make more sense in just a minute. Number 3, you determine the most effective appeal. So that's important because there's a strong likelihood that you're going to have examples of rhetoric where there are multiple appeals used. When you're thinking about the multiple appeals being used, you want to think which one has the greatest impact on the audience. And that last step is that you want to explain the function of the appeal. What is it that makes this appeal effective? So what I want to do is, before we go into looking at the example on the worksheet, I want to make sure that we can kind of see what these look like in practice. Take for a moment this example. I'm going to read it in my best Edwards impersonation. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends the arrow at your heart, and strains the bow, and it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. Well, that's terrifying. When I think about this text, the first thing that I want to do is to just kind of paraphrase. I want to look at it and say, what in the world is he saying? There are so many commas, there's so much there for me to think of. I don't know what he's saying. And so for me, I look at this and I read and I annotate it and I think about the idea of that bow of God's wrath is bent. The arrow is ready, and that justice bends the arrow at your heart. The key word here being justice. I must deserve this arrow coming into my heart. It's straining the bow, and it is only the mere pleasure of God, oh, by the way, he's angry, that keeps the arrow one moment from. So in other words, that's the only reason that it isn't already drunk with my blood. That's the reason it's not already going through my heart. So the next thing I need to do is to think through each of the three appeals. Now that I understand what we're saying, I can start to think about what it's doing. So I'm going to just kind of ask myself, does it seem like it's giving me a connection to ethos? Is there credibility or ethics here? I don't really have anything that lets me know that I can trust or respect the speaker. I don't really, aside from the fact that he's a preacher, I don't necessarily have any authority on it. The fact that he's a preacher is significant, so I could argue just his presence being there, him being the speaker, is the ethos, but I know that there's probably something more in this. So then I want to ask myself, does this make sense? Based on facts, statistics, is there evidence for a claim? This one doesn't go so far as to make a claim and provide evidence, and there isn't really any statistic or fact that backs it up. But what I do notice is that there seems to be a flow here with an example, and it seems to me like this is a direct pull at fear. And it's a pretty powerful one. So what does the text seem to do? Well, it seems to ignite fear in the congregation. The bow and the arrow seems very important because we know that this is a time period when the Indians and the Pilgrims have gone through their situation where they came in and they came up with these agreements on how we're going to treat each other. And we're starting to see the cultures kind of clash a little bit. And the weapon of choice for the Indians is the bow and arrow. So my next thing is to think about the most effective appeal. What is going to have the greatest impact on the audience? I could argue that there's a hint of ethos here because of his ethical role and responsibility as a religious leader. But clearly, the appeal to fear, or pathos, is more obvious. So then I want to explain the function of the appeal and what makes this effective. So if this were the one on my worksheet, I would essentially say, in this example, Edwards is connecting the bow and arrows the Indians use to justice of God. The people would have fear because of their personal connections to the damage of an arrow. By thinking of justice as the arrow coming at my heart, I am scared and I kind of want to think about changing my ways. Now, there's a lot of teacher talk on that, but I really wanted us to be able to see these questions and see where we're going and see what we're looking at. So I want you to just kind of stop for a moment, process through this. Let's look at another example. I want us to be able to see how all of the different pieces kind of come together. And so here is another excerpt of text. And I'm going to again read it in my fantastic Edwards impersonation. Many are daily coming from the east, west, north, and south, many that were very lately in the same miserable condition you are in now in a happy state, with their hearts filled with love to him who has loved him and washed them from their sins in his own blood. The first thing I want to do is to just kind of paraphrase it. Many are coming daily. They're coming from all over the place. They were in the same miserable condition you were in. But now they're in a happy state. Their hearts are filled with love to him who has washed them from their sins in his own blood. Now that's an important thing to think about. Alright, once I know what he's saying, the next thing I'm going to do is to think through the appeals. What does the text seem to be doing? My last example was clear appeal to fear, and I don't really get that fear from this one. This one does seem, though, to be giving me some examples, to kind of be logically giving me an explanation for what's happening. So I could argue there might be a little bit of logos. I also can look at this and I can see a little bit of ethos. There's definitely the connection with the illusion of Christ, because that would be who loved them, who washed them from their sins in his own blood. So we definitely see that appeal to the higher authority or the credibility here. They were once miserable like you, but now they're happy. How did they get there? Because their hearts are filled with love to him, and after all, he is the one who washed them from his sins in his own blood. Then, once I kind of have identified, I think there's a little bit of ethos and I think that there is a little bit of logos here, I want to think about which has the greatest impact on the audience. In this example, I think it's going to be ethos. The connection with the allusion to Christ is very, very strong. He didn't have to add that. He could have just said they were once miserable like you, but now they're happy. But that wasn't enough. He went on to say that their hearts were filled with his love. He went on to say that he had washed them from sins. And he even added in his own blood. So the degree to which we've got the repetition of the sacrifice of Christ really lets us know that there's some ethos going on here. So then the next thing I want to do is to explain the function of the appeal. What makes this effective? Well, this is clearly ethos because Edward's purpose is to inspire hope for those who are terrified that they're going to hell. And he's describing how those who were once sinners are now going to be converted, and he's using the illusion to show what good Christians do to save themselves by accepting Christ and being saved. So there's clear ethos in this example. So we looked at an example with Pathos and we looked at an example with Ethos. And now I want to get you into the reading strategy model. So as we think through this process and we think through these different steps, we're going to go through the same questions that we went through before and try to address the rhetorical appeal in this example. Okay, so I want to go through and make sure that I understand this passage. And as I do that, I'm going to think, there's a dreadful pit in the glowing flames of the wrath of God. There is hell's wide mouth open, and you have nothing to stand upon, nor anything to take hold of. There is nothing between you and hell but air. It is only the power and mere pleasure of God that holds you up. Let's see, I kind of noticed the dreadful pit of the glowing flames of the wrath of God. Those are definitely words that tell me he's kind of angry. Hell's wide mouth open. And then that there's nothing to stand upon. That there's nothing between you and hell but air. And the power and pleasure of God holding you up. Those are my key terms. So my first question comes back to what's he saying, what's happening. And essentially what he's saying is that when I think about the situation, beneath you is hell. And it's not just hell, it is a burning hell of God's wrath. That diction's important because it's telling us that God is very angry because he's got this wrath. It's not just hell, it is a burning hell. And then he says, the only reason you aren't there yet is because God doesn't want you there. Now, I don't want to leave out any of the details. So I think it's important that he signifies that there's nothing between you and hell but the air. That there's nothing there. So as I look at this, beneath you is hell, a burning hell of God's wrath. The only reason you aren't there yet is because God doesn't want you there. Once I do that, I want to think about those rhetorical appeals. So I want to think about, what does the text seem like it's doing? So I think about, what does the text seem like it's doing? And I want to just kind of go through those three. In my head, I always think ELP, ethos, logos, pathos. So that's where I start. And I'm going to start with ethics. Well, in so far as ethos, he is the religious leader. He's kind of like the preacher. So he's got to have credibility there. I kind of can go there, but I don't necessarily see that connection to that higher power. So that one's really kind of weak, and I wouldn't really want to talk about that. And the text that I'm using doesn't do anything to prove that you can respect or you can trust him as the speaker or that he's the authority on it. So that would be too much of a stretch. So then I want to think about logos. When I'm thinking about logos, I want to think about logic and I want to think about philosophy. And this one does kind of make sense because he gives the evidence for the claim. So he says that there's that dreadful pit of hell, and you've got nothing there except for God. There's nothing between you and hell but the air. So I could argue that that's there a little bit as well. Then I could say he's rational, so that would be another extension, and trying to explain to the audience why they are not in hell. So that's a good one. Then that last one I think of, because remember in my head I think ELP, pathos is that emotional connection. And for me, I remember pathos as path, and I think of sympathy and empathy. And to me, I'm feeling scared of hell. I am scared of the wrath that I might endure. So the next thing I want to do is think about the one that is the most effective. Now, in this part of the text, I want to focus on just the excerpt that I've been given. There is a dreadful pit of glowing flames, and it is the wrath of God. We have the imagery of the gates of hell being a wide open mouth waiting to swallow us up. And there's nothing to stand upon. There's nothing to take hold of. There's nothing between you and hell but the air. Only the power and pleasure of God that holds you up. As I think through this one, I think through the idea that he seems to be sort of reporting it to me. He's sort of telling me this is what it's like, and here's what we need to kind of see, and here's how we need to process it. So I think that there's definitely some appeal to fear, but I think that you could make a really strong argument that it is the logos that is most effective. So in this example, logos is used to provide rationale for why the audience is not yet in hell, even though God is full of wrath. I'm also just going to kind of note that with this, it almost seems like objective reporting. He's being very matter of fact in this statement. So for my interpretation, I would definitely go with logos. Now, I'm going to step out here. I've gone through all of my steps. I started with my process. I went through the paraphrase. I thought through what the text is doing in my rhetorical appeals, and then I analyzed and I evaluated the function of the rhetorical appeal that was most effective to my opinion. It is possible that you would have more than one rhetorical appeal. Based on your interpretation, it is possible that you might interpret it differently from another person. But if you do pathos every single time, you're taking the easy way out, and I'm not going to let that happen. Because you're going to have to justify it in writing, This is just the first step. So, at this point, we've looked at an example of ethos, we've looked at an example of logos, and we've looked at an example of pathos. What I'd like for you to do is go through your packet, reading through the text and the excerpts, identifying the rhetorical appeals and the function of the rhetorical appeal, so that you can internalize and so that you can begin to evaluate the effectiveness of rhetoric in a speech. If you have any questions, please feel free to send an email at any time. You may ask someone seated near you if they're at the same area in the lesson. You may ask your teacher, or don't forget we've got the back channel conversation going, and you can open that link to have that dialogue to ask questions and to read through what other people say.